Case 1. The Justin Ross Harris case. Every case file has a starting fact that everything else gets measured against. In this case, that fact is simple and undisputed. On the afternoon of June 18, 2014, a 22-month-old boy named Cooper Harris died after being left inside a parked vehicle for approximately 7 hours in high 80s-degree heat. What is disputed, what an entire trial, and later an entire appeal, turned on, is why. Welcome to the Predator's Archive. Before we begin, if you want more investigations like this one, tap that subscribe button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and give this video a like so more people can see it. Now, let's get into the file. In the spring of 2012, Justin Ross Harris relocated from Tuscaloosa, Alabama to the Atlanta metropolitan area to take a position as a web developer with the Home Depot's corporate offices. He lived with his wife and their son, Cooper. By the time of the events at the center of this case, Cooper was 22 months old. On the morning of June 18, 2014, Harris's normal routine, dropping Cooper at daycare before continuing to his office, did not happen as usual. Instead, Cooper remained in his car seat in the back of Harris's sport utility vehicle in the parking lot of Harris's workplace in the Vinings area of Cobb County. Outside temperatures that day reached at least the high 80s, in degrees Fahrenheit. Cooper was not discovered until Harris returned to the vehicle that afternoon. He did not survive. Harris told responding officers that he had simply forgotten his son was in the car, that he had intended to make the daycare stop, and it had slipped from his mind amid the ordinary distractions of a workday morning. This single claim became the fault line of the entire case. Was this a tragic, documented type of accident, the kind that has occurred in a number of similar cases involving children unintentionally left in vehicles nationwide, or was it staged to look like one? Cobb County police detectives and prosecutors from the Cobb County District Attorney's Office faced an unusual evidentiary problem from the outset. There was no eyewitness to the moment Cooper was left in the vehicle. There was no confession. There was no physical struggle. No weapon. No scene in the traditional forensic sense beyond the vehicle itself. If this case was going to be proven as an intentional act, it would have to be proven largely through reconstruction, through the digital and physical trail Harris had left behind in the days, weeks, and months before June 18th. That reconstruction became the defining feature of the investigation. Digital forensic examiners recovered Harris's message history, including communications sent and received on the very morning Cooper died. Investigators paired this with cell phone location data, badge swipe logs from Harris's office building, and surveillance footage from a shopping center Harris had stopped at that morning. Piece by piece, detectives assembled a minute-by-minute account of Harris's movements, an approach that is now standard in cases with limited direct evidence but was, at the time, one of the more comprehensive digital reconstructions presented in a Georgia courtroom. They reviewed Harris's workplace computer for search activity relating to topics such as heat exposure in vehicles and the physiological effects of hyperthermia on children, evidence prosecutors would use to argue Harris had researched the very mechanism that killed his son before it occurred. They interviewed shopping center employees who had interacted with Harris that morning. They examined months of prior routine, badge access, and communication patterns, attempting to establish whether June 18th represented a genuine deviation from habit or a deliberate one. The Cobb County Police Department's Digital Forensics and Technology Unit was central to this effort, extracting data from multiple devices and cross-referencing timestamps against physical location evidence to build a timeline precise enough to withstand cross-examination. Given the volume of pretrial publicity the case generated in the Atlanta media market, the trial venue was moved to Brunswick in Glynn County, Georgia, a change of venue, a standard procedural mechanism used to help secure a jury pool less shaped by extensive local news coverage of a case that had, by the time of trial, already become a matter of national interest. The trial stretched across several weeks. Digital forensic examiners walked jurors through the recovered communications and metadata line by line. Medical experts explained, in clinical terms, the physiological effects of hyperthermia on a young child's body under prolonged heat exposure. Character witnesses appeared for both sides. For the prosecution, individuals who described aspects of Harris's personal conduct and relationships that prosecutors argued established motive. For the defense, individuals who spoke to Harris's ordinary role as a father and husband. Law enforcement officers testified regarding how the vehicle, the parking lot, and the surrounding scene had been processed. The prosecution's theory rested on the proposition that the digital evidence, taken as a whole, showed a man who had researched the means, established an opportunity, and possessed a motive tied to dissatisfaction with his family life. The defense countered that memory lapses of exactly this kind, a parent's brain effectively overwriting an intended stop with the autopilot of a more habitual route, have been documented in a number of similar tragedies nationwide, and argued that circumstantial digital evidence about a person's personal life did not equate to proof of an intentional act against a specific person on a specific day. On November 14, 2016, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on 8 counts. These included malice murder and felony murder charges tied directly to Cooper's death, along with separate charges relating to sexual exploitation of a minor that had surfaced as investigators combed through the broader body of Harris's digital communications during the original inquiry. Charges that were legally distinct from the child death counts but were tried together in a single proceeding before the same jury. On December 5, 2016, the trial judge sentenced Harris to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the murder counts, with additional consecutive years attached to the separate sexual exploitation counts. For 2 years, this stood as the final word on the case. It was not. On June 22, 2022, the Supreme Court of Georgia handed down a 6-3 decision, authored by Chief Justice David Namias, reversing the convictions connected specifically to Cooper's death. The court's reasoning is worth stating precisely, because it is easy to summarize inaccurately. The justices found that the jury at trial had been exposed to what the opinion described as an extensive amount of improperly admitted evidence concerning Harris's personal conduct, evidence unrelated to the actual events of June 18, 2014, but which the trial court had allowed in as part of the state's motive theory. The Supreme Court concluded it could not say it was highly probable that this improperly admitted evidence had no bearing on the jury's guilty verdicts regarding Cooper's death. In plain terms, the state's highest court found a meaningful risk that jurors convicted Harris of killing his son, in part because of unrelated personal conduct that legally should never have been placed before them, not solely because of evidence tied to the events of that specific day. The separate convictions for sexual exploitation of a minor were not disturbed by this ruling. Those charges rested on their own independent evidence and remained in place. In 2023, Cobb County prosecutors announced they would not seek to retry the reversed murder charges. For viewers unfamiliar with how this works, a conviction is not automatically final the moment a jury delivers its verdict. Convicted defendants are generally entitled to at least one level of appellate review. An appellate court like the Supreme Court of Georgia does not reweigh evidence or redecide guilt. It asks a narrower question. Did the trial court make a legal error? And if so, was that error significant enough that it likely affected the outcome? If the answer is yes, the court can reverse the conviction, sending the matter back to the state to decide whether to retry, negotiate a plea, or decline to pursue the case further. That is precisely the sequence that occurred here. The Harris case remains one of the most closely studied examples of digital forensic evidence carrying a prosecution almost entirely on its own, in the absence of a confession, an eyewitness, or conventional physical evidence. It is also one of the most prominent recent examples of an appellate court reversing a high-profile murder conviction years after sentencing, a reminder that a trial verdict, however much public attention it receives, is not always the last chapter. Case 2. The Nicole Finn case. Natalie Finn was 16 years old when she died in October of 2016. She was the adopted daughter of Nicole Finn. Prosecutors alleged that in the months leading up to her death, Natalie and 2 siblings living in the same household were confined within the home and denied adequate food and consistent access to a bathroom. What sets this case apart from a purely criminal narrative is the institutional record running alongside it. Months before Natalie died, neighbors and school officials had already reported concerns about the children's welfare to the Iowa Department of Human Services. In the aftermath of the case, a caseworker assigned to the family was dismissed, and the handling of those earlier reports drew formal inquiry from state legislators and the Iowa Office of Ombudsman. Investigators built the case on 3 converging categories of evidence: forensic pathology, digital communications, and direct testimony from people who had witnessed the conditions inside the home. The former Polk County medical examiner, Dr. Francis Garrity, testified to Natalie's physical condition at the time of death, describing her weight and body mass index as reflecting a severe degree of weight loss relative to expected norms for someone her age and height. His testimony attributed the cause of death to denial of critical care and severe malnutrition, framed in clinical, physiological terms. A West Des Moines police detective, Chris Morgan, testified to text messages recovered from Nicole Finn's phone through digital forensic examination, including a message from March of 2016, months before Natalie's death, in which Finn referred to the children in dismissive and dehumanizing language. This is a pattern seen across several cases in this file. Digital evidence that predates a death by months, used by prosecutors not to reconstruct a single day, but to establish a defendant's state of mind sustained over an extended period. Surviving siblings gave testimony describing the conditions inside the household directly, offering jurors a first-hand account rather than a reconstructed one. A neighbor also testified that she had called police at the end of May in 2016 specifically to report suspected neglect, establishing on the record that concerns had already reached law enforcement and child welfare channels well before Natalie's death. Nicole Finn pleaded not guilty. The trial lasted a little over 2 weeks. Jury deliberations concluded in approximately 1 day, a short deliberation period given the number and severity of the charges, suggesting the combined weight of the medical testimony, the digital evidence, and the surviving children's accounts left jurors with little doubt. On December 21, 2017, the jury convicted Nicole Finn of first-degree murder, 3 counts of first-degree kidnapping connected to the confinement of the other children, and child endangerment. The defense argued during trial that Finn was detached from reality at the time of the events, an argument distinct from a formal insanity defense, offered as context rather than as a legal excuse. The verdict indicates the jury was not persuaded to reduce the charges on that basis. Assistant Polk County Attorney Brett Lucas, speaking after the verdict, called it the most severe case he had encountered in 18 years as a prosecutor. On January 26, 2018, Judge Karen Romano sentenced Nicole Finn to 3 life sentences and ordered no further contact with the surviving children, a protective measure common in cases where a convicted parent's continued contact with surviving children is deemed contrary to their welfare. Natalie's father, Joseph Finn, was separately charged with kidnapping, neglect, and child endangerment connected to the same underlying facts and was tried in a separate proceeding, a standard prosecutorial practice of evaluating each adult's individual culpability independently, even within the same household. This case is frequently cited in child welfare policy discussions precisely because of the institutional layer running beside the criminal case. Reports had reached state authorities, a caseworker had been assigned, and the outcome was nonetheless catastrophic. The Iowa Office of Ombudsman's subsequent review became part of a broader statewide conversation about caseworker training, caseload management, and the thresholds used to determine when a report requires an in-person welfare check rather than a file review. Cases like this one are studied not only for what happened in the courtroom, but for what they reveal about the systems meant to intervene earlier. Case 3, the Sheborah Latrice Thomas case. On August 12, 2016, 2 children, a 5-year-old daughter named Kayana and a 7-year-old son named Araylin, died at a family residence in southeast Houston. Their mother was Sheborah Latrice Thomas. The case reached law enforcement because Thomas told a friend what had occurred. When that friend understood the statement was not a joke, he contacted the Houston Police Department, which then recovered the children's remains near the residence. The Houston Police Department's case rested on several converging elements: Thomas's own disclosure to the cooperating witness, that witness's account to police, the recovery of the children's remains at the scene, and medical examiner findings establishing cause and manner of death for each child. Investigators also documented prior child welfare history relevant to the case, as is standard practice in building a comprehensive file. Thomas had temporarily lost custody of her children in 2012. Additionally, records showed that Child Protective Services and Houston police personnel had visited the family's residence the day before the children's deaths, a detail that became part of the public record and a point of scrutiny for those examining how welfare checks are conducted and documented in the period immediately preceding a tragedy. Thomas was charged with 2 counts of capital murder, the most serious homicide charge available under Texas law, applicable in cases involving multiple victims or victims meeting other statutorily defined criteria, including victims under a certain age. The case's path through the court system was extended significantly by competency proceedings, a legal process used to determine whether a defendant is mentally capable of understanding the charges against her and assisting in her own defense, a threshold legally distinct from an insanity defense, which concerns mental state at the time of the offense rather than at the time of trial. On February 27, 2023, roughly 6.5 years after the deaths, Thomas entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of murder as part of a negotiated agreement resulting in a fixed sentence and avoiding a full trial. Thomas received a sentence of 40 years in prison. Harris County District Attorney Kim Ogg addressed the resolution publicly, stating that the plea agreement meant family members would not be required to testify and that Thomas could not appeal either the conviction or the sentence. Benefits prosecutors frequently cite when explaining a preference for negotiated resolutions in cases where testimony would require surviving family to relive difficult events in open court. Assistant District Attorneys James O'Donnell and Sarah Moss handled the prosecution. Competency to stand trial proceedings are a constitutionally required safeguard, not an unusual detour. When a court has reason to question a defendant's present mental capacity to understand proceedings or assist counsel, the case pauses for evaluation, sometimes multiple evaluations, sometimes involving a period of treatment aimed at restoring competency before the case can proceed. In this case, that process, layered onto standard capital murder pretrial litigation, stretched the gap between the offense and its ultimate resolution to more than 6 years. This case illustrates how a prosecution can be built substantially on witness disclosure and cooperation rather than on laboratory-based physical evidence alone, and how competency proceedings, a routine part of the system, not an aberration, can extend a case's timeline by years. Case 4. The Amber Craker case. On January 18, 2016, a newborn infant, given the name Ashley by responding officers, was found deceased inside a residence on South 25th Street in Abilene, Texas. The infant's mother, Amber Craker, 18 years old at the time, had arrived separately at a local hospital. Police were dispatched to the residence and located the infant there. Craker initially told investigators the infant's injuries had occurred accidentally while she was cutting the umbilical cord, an account investigators would test directly against the forensic findings of the autopsy. Establishing live birth is a required element for a homicide charge in newborn death cases under Texas law, because a stillbirth, death before or during delivery, cannot, by definition, be prosecuted as a homicide. Forensic examiners addressed this question directly in the autopsy, applying recognized pathological indicators used to distinguish a live birth followed by death from a stillbirth. The autopsy determined the infant had died from injuries consistent with a sharp implement. Craker subsequently admitted to police that she had caused injury to the newborn and had cleaned the scene afterward. Her co-defendant and fiancé at the time, Damian Kate, provided a separate statement to Abilene police investigators, which became part of the broader evidentiary record, even though he was charged separately. At trial, forensic pathology experts explained the live birth determination and the nature of the injuries to the jury. Police detectives who processed the scene testified. School faculty from the Abilene Independent School District who had known Craker were called to provide background testimony. Craker was found incompetent to stand trial at one stage of the proceedings in 2016 and was committed to the North Texas State Hospital in Vernon, Texas for treatment, before later being restored to competency by the court, meaning medical professionals determined, after a period of treatment, that she had regained the capacity to understand the proceedings and assist her attorneys, allowing the case to move forward. A grand jury returned an indictment on a charge of capital murder. Her trial lasted 3 days and began on October 2, 2017. After approximately 5 hours of deliberation, a jury of 6 men and 6 women convicted Craker of capital murder and of tampering with evidence. On October 5, 2017, Craker received a mandatory sentence of life in prison for the capital murder conviction. Mandatory because Texas law provides no jury sentencing discretion for capital murder, where the death penalty is not sought or applicable, along with a consecutive 19-year term for evidence tampering. The 11th Court of Appeals, based in Eastland, Texas, later affirmed both convictions on direct appeal, finding no reversible legal error in the trial proceedings. Her co-defendant, Damian Kate, was charged in a separate proceeding. The live birth determination is one of the more technically demanding areas of forensic pathology. Examiners look for physiological markers, evidence that the lungs had expanded and taken in air, which would not occur before birth, along with other indicators of independent physiological function after delivery, distinct from patterns present in utero. These findings allow a forensic pathologist to state, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, whether a newborn was born alive before sustaining fatal injuries, a legal prerequisite for a homicide charge in most American jurisdictions, including Texas. This case is frequently referenced in forensic pathology training contexts because of the live birth determination at its center, and it also illustrates how competency proceedings function as a distinct, non-guilt-related phase of a criminal case. Case 5, the Rosemary Paige Harrah case. On December 11, 2016, first responders were called to the home of Rosemary Paige Harrah near Needville in Fort Bend County, Texas. Harrah's 2-month-old son, Lucian Angst, was found unresponsive. Harrah told paramedics she had fed the infant the previous night and discovered him unresponsive the following morning, an account that, on its face, was consistent with a number of natural infant death scenarios investigators are trained to rule out before pursuing a criminal theory. Approximately 10 days after Lucian's death, the Needville Police Department received an anonymous email. The email reported that a user identified by the name Shimmering had posted on Glow Nurture, an application for pregnancy and parenting support with social networking features allowing users to share experiences and receive peer feedback, expressing that she was considering harming her baby. Other users on the platform had responded by urging her to seek counseling or consider adoption. The post referenced the child's name directly, allowing the anonymous tipster to connect it to a real, identifiable family. A Needville police lieutenant connected the tip to the recent death within the department's jurisdiction. Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office detectives interviewed Harrah on December 27, 2016. She confirmed authorship of the post and gave a statement. According to statements later made by prosecutors, Harrah told Detective Cantu that she had covered the infant's face with a blanket and applied pressure until he stopped moving. The Galveston County Medical Examiner's Office, which provides forensic pathology services to Fort Bend County under an interlocal agreement, common among smaller Texas counties without a full-time in-house medical examiner, ruled the cause of death suffocation. Prosecutor Therese Buis noted publicly that the child had not shown obvious external signs of trauma, which is precisely why the digital tip proved pivotal. Absent it, investigators would have had comparatively little to distinguish this death from a natural infant death. Harrah was initially held on a charge of injury to a child and was indicted on capital murder in March of 2017. In October of 2019, she pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of murder, a resolution reached after roughly 2.5 years of pretrial proceedings. Harrah was sentenced to 40 years in prison and is required under Texas law to serve half of that sentence before becoming eligible for parole. District Attorney Brian Middleton and Child Abuse Division Deputy Chief Therese Buis both made public statements addressing the resolution. This case is regularly cited in discussions of digital evidence, precisely because of how it inverts the usual order of a death investigation. Ordinarily, physical evidence at a scene or an autopsy points investigators toward a suspect. Here, the physical evidence was ambiguous, a young infant with no obvious external trauma, and it was a piece of unrelated online activity, shared in what its author likely believed was a private, supportive peer space that supplied the missing piece. It illustrates both the reach of digital forensics into spaces users do not consider law enforcement adjacent, and the continuing importance of ordinary members of the public recognizing significance in what they encounter online. Case 6, the Jessica Prater and Adam Caldwell case. In April of 2016, Jessica Prater and her 5-year-old son, Zachary Prater Stokes, moved into the Orangevale, California home of her boyfriend Adam Caldwell. Prosecutors later alleged that both Caldwell and subsequently Prater subjected Zachary to escalating abuse in the weeks that followed. On June 2, 2016, Prater called emergency services, reporting that Zachary had swallowed water in a bathtub and was unresponsive. The scene did not match the call. Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies and Sacramento Metropolitan Fire District personnel who responded found the child fully clothed and dry, located in a bedroom, not near a bathtub, directly inconsistent with a drowning reported to have just occurred. This discrepancy redirected the investigation toward a homicide inquiry within hours, well before any laboratory results were available. Hospital medical staff who examined the child told investigators his condition reflected a pattern consistent with abuse over time, not a single accidental incident. A subsequent autopsy performed by the Sacramento County Coroner's Office determined the cause of death to be a combination of blunt force injuries and water submersion, two mechanisms combined, rather than a simple accidental drowning explanation. Investigators also gathered statements from acquaintances of Prater and Caldwell describing the household environment, which combined with the scene evidence and the medical findings formed the basis of the case against both defendants. Both Prater and Caldwell were arrested June 3, 2016, the day after the emergency call. The case proceeded through nearly 3 years of pretrial litigation, a timeline further extended by court scheduling disruptions connected to public health protocols in the year 2020, which affected court operations and jury availability nationwide. Caldwell's trial concluded with a conviction on October 8, 2021, on charges of second-degree murder and child assault resulting in death. Prater's trial concluded separately, with a conviction returned November 4, 2021, on charges of first-degree murder by torture, child assault resulting in death, and child abuse resulting in death, a more serious set of charges than those against Caldwell, reflecting the jury's assessment of her individual culpability. Judge Stephen Acquisto sentenced both defendants to 25 years to life. Caldwell was sentenced November 19, 2021. Prater was sentenced December 10, 2021. This case is a clean illustration of a broader investigative principle. The earliest, most basic observations at a scene often carry disproportionate weight later in a case. A child reported to have just drowned, found instead clothed and dry in another room, is not a forensic finding requiring a lab. It is a plain contradiction that any trained first responder can recognize immediately, and it is frequently the detail that determines whether a death is initially treated as an accident or as a homicide from the outset. This case also demonstrates how two co-defendants sharing a household and a victim can be charged with, and convicted of, distinct offenses reflecting differing degrees of individual culpability. Case 7. The Lynn Lee Case. On the night of March 13, 2016, in an apartment in the Sunset Park section of Brooklyn, New York, the 2-year-old daughter of Lynn Lee, identified in reporting as Melody, died. The child's father was performing resuscitation efforts when police arrived and was not charged in connection with the death. The family, including Melody and her 4-year-old brother, had recently relocated to Brooklyn after the children had spent time living with grandparents in China. The investigation combined forensic pathology with a recorded police interview. The Office of the New York City Chief Medical Examiner, under Dr. Barbara Sampson, ruled the cause of death drowning and the manner of death homicide. The medical examiner's findings also documented bruising and contusions considered alongside the drowning determination. Investigators obtained a videotaped interview with Lynn Lee, in which she made statements later used at trial to challenge the account she gave from the witness stand, a common prosecutorial technique of comparing earlier recorded statements to later trial testimony to highlight inconsistencies for the jury. The case also involved evidence concerning Lee's conduct toward her 4-year-old son the day before Melody's death, forming the basis of a separate assault charge. Lee was charged with murder, manslaughter, and acting in a manner injurious to a child. At trial before Brooklyn Supreme Court Justice Deborah Dowling in 2019, the jury acquitted Lee of second-degree murder, her top charge. On June 4, 2019, the same jury convicted her of first-degree manslaughter in connection with Melody's death and first-degree attempted assault in connection with the son. On February 26, 2020, Justice Dowling sentenced Lee to 18 years in prison. Assistant District Attorney Roger McCready prosecuted the case under Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez. When a defendant is charged with a top count like murder, the jury is typically also instructed on lesser included offenses, here, manslaughter, which carry a lower burden regarding the defendant's mental state. Murder generally requires proof of intent to kill or a comparably culpable mental state, beyond a reasonable doubt. Manslaughter may rest on a finding of recklessness or a lesser degree of culpability. A split verdict, acquittal on murder, conviction on manslaughter, reflects a jury's considered judgment that a death occurred and the defendant bore responsibility, without the evidence meeting the higher bar specifically required for murder. This case is a useful illustration of how a jury can weigh medical examiner testimony, a recorded police interview, and courtroom testimony from the defendant, and arrive at a verdict reflecting a specific, considered reading of intent, not a simple wholesale acceptance or rejection of the state's case. Case 8, the Joseph Walsh and Kristen Berry case. Before anything else, the killing in this case was attributed to the father, Joseph Walsh. The mother, Kristen Berry, was not charged as the person who caused the child's death. She pleaded to aggravated manslaughter connected to her role after the fact and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors as a witness against Walsh. We maintain that distinction throughout. 9-week-old Chance Walsh was reported missing by his grandparents on October 4, 2015. His parents, Joseph Walsh and Kristen Berry, had by then left Florida. Investigators tracked the couple, and they were arrested in South Carolina. Berry subsequently led investigators to the location of the child's remains, recovered from a wooded area near Northport, Florida in October of 2015. This case relied substantially on a cooperating parent witness, a common but delicate posture in cases where one adult agrees to testify against another in exchange for a negotiated plea. Berry provided an account placing responsibility for the child's death on Walsh and agreed to testify against him at trial. Because she was the only person with direct knowledge of what had occurred, her cooperation was central to any future case against Walsh. Florida State Attorney Ed Brodsky later addressed elements of the forensic and medical evidence at Berry's plea hearing, where the factual basis for a plea is typically summarized on the record even without a trial. Berry pleaded no contest to aggravated manslaughter in January of 2016 and was sentenced to 25 years, under an agreement to testify against Walsh. A grand jury indicted Walsh on first-degree murder in March of 2016, based significantly on the anticipated testimony Berry had agreed to provide. Then the case turned. Berry was found dead in her jail cell in an apparent suicide in September of 2016, before Walsh's trial could occur. With the state's key witness no longer available, prosecutors negotiated a plea with Walsh, second-degree murder and aggravated child abuse, rather than proceeding to trial on the original first-degree murder charge. Berry received 25 years in January of 2016. Walsh received 45 years under his plea agreement in 2017. This case is a clear window into a structural vulnerability prosecutors face whenever a case depends heavily on a single cooperating witness, particularly a co-defendant. When that witness becomes unavailable, through death, a change in willingness to testify, or a successful defense challenge to reliability, the state's case can weaken significantly, even when prosecutors remain confident in their underlying theory. This is why prosecutors typically try to corroborate cooperating witness testimony with independent evidence wherever possible, so a case does not rest entirely on one witness's continued availability. This case documents exactly how the loss of a cooperating witness reshaped a prosecution, moving it from an intended first-degree murder trial to a negotiated plea on a lesser murder charge. Case 9, the Daniel Ramirez and Angela Jimenez-Ramirez case. The 3-month-old daughter of Daniel Ramirez and Angela Jimenez-Ramirez became unresponsive in October of 2014. She was airlifted from Visalia to Valley Children's Hospital and died October 16, 2014, after being removed from life support. A medical examination found multiple fractures across several areas of her body, a finding that prompted immediate concern among treating physicians, and, per standard protocol for suspicious pediatric injuries, a report to law enforcement. This case is grounded in pediatric radiology and forensic medicine. The pattern of multiple fractures identified in medical imaging prompted a homicide investigation conducted jointly by the Visalia Police Department and the Tulare County District Attorney's Bureau of Investigations, a specialized unit many larger California district attorneys' offices maintain for complex cases. In late February of 2016, roughly a year and 4 months after the child's death, reflecting the substantial time such investigations require to gather medical records, expert opinions, and grand jury testimony, a Tulare County criminal grand jury heard the prosecution's evidence and indicted both parents. They were taken into custody February 26, 2016. The case proceeded through several years of pretrial litigation, typical in cases involving competing medical expert testimony, where both sides retain their own forensic and radiological experts, requiring extensive scheduling and preparation. In April of 2022, a Tulare County Superior Court jury convicted both defendants. Daniel Ramirez was convicted of felony involuntary manslaughter and felony child abuse, with special allegations of great bodily injury and willful harm resulting in death. Angela Jimenez-Ramirez was convicted of felony involuntary manslaughter and felony child abuse, with a special allegation of willful harm resulting in death. Jimenez-Ramirez was released based on time already served. Daniel Ramirez remained in custody, with bail set pending a formal sentencing hearing scheduled for May 24, 2022. The prosecution was led by senior Tulare County District Attorney's Office prosecutors from the Crimes Against Children Unit, Chelsea Waite and Sean Sangri. Multiple fracture cases involving infants present a well-documented forensic challenge. Pediatric radiologists and forensic pathologists must distinguish accidental fractures from those consistent with underlying medical conditions affecting bone density, and from patterns the medical literature considers more indicative of inflicted trauma. Fractures in multiple locations, fractures at different healing stages suggesting injuries at different points in time, and fracture types uncommon in typical accidental handling. Expert witnesses on both sides walk juries through imaging studies, explaining in accessible terms why a given pattern is or is not consistent with the explanation offered. This case is documented here primarily through detailed local reporting corroborated by the Tulare County District Attorney's Office, and it illustrates how a case built on pediatric radiology can take years to move from indictment to verdict. Case 10, the Bella Bond Baby Doe Case. The person convicted of killing Bella Bond was Michael McCarthy, the boyfriend of Bella's mother, not a parent of the child. Bella's mother, Rochelle Bond, was charged and convicted only as an accessory after the fact, along with a separate charge related to public assistance benefits. We include this case because a parent was criminally charged in direct connection with the child's death, and because its forensic identification methods are historically significant, but the roles of each adult are stated plainly throughout. The remains of a 2-year-old girl were discovered in a bag on the shore of Deer Island in Winthrop, Massachusetts on June 25, 2015, by a woman walking her dog. For months, the child's identity was unknown, and she became known publicly as Baby Doe. She was later identified as Bella Bond. Investigators created and circulated a computer-generated composite image of the child, shared widely across social media, alongside images of a distinctive zebra print blanket and polka dot leggings recovered with her remains, a combination of forensic facial approximation and identifiable clothing designed to maximize the chance that someone who had seen the child alive would recognize her. Investigators pursued several hundred leads nationwide as a result, a volume requiring significant investigative resources to review and rule out. The case broke in September of 2015 when Rochelle Bond told a friend, Michael Sprinsky, that McCarthy had killed Bella and that she had helped dispose of the remains. Sprinsky reported this to authorities, once again illustrating, as in several cases in this file, the role an ordinary member of the public can play in resolving a case through a private disclosure. McCarthy was arrested that same month. McCarthy was arraigned on first-degree murder in Suffolk Superior Court in January of 2016 and pleaded not guilty. Rochelle Bond reached a negotiated plea on accessory after the fact, plus a separate larceny count related to continuing to collect public assistance after Bella's death. She testified as the prosecution's central witness against McCarthy, At trial in 2017, McCarthy was convicted of second-degree murder on June 26, 2017. Judge Janet Sanders sentenced McCarthy to life with parole eligibility after 20 years on June 28, 2017. Rochelle Bond received time served plus probation under her cooperation agreement. Cases involving unidentified victims require investigators to work backward from remains to an identity before a traditional homicide investigation can even fully begin. Techniques used nationally include forensic facial approximation, in which an artist or software generates a likely likeness based on skeletal and soft tissue characteristics, comparison of clothing and personal items against missing persons reports, and, in more recent cases, forensic genetic genealogy comparing DNA against public genealogical databases. This case predates the widespread use of genetic genealogy in everyday casework and instead relied on the more traditional combination of a composite image, distinctive personal items, and a large public appeal, a combination that ultimately led to resolution through a witness disclosure rather than a laboratory match. The public identification campaign in this case remains one of the more widely studied examples of using computer-generated imagery and mass public engagement to identify an otherwise unknown child victim, and it directly enabled the disclosure that broke the case open. 10 cases, 10 investigations, each built on a different forensic discipline. A few patterns are worth carrying forward. These cases rarely resolve quickly. Several took 3 to 7 years from offense to final resolution, shaped by competency proceedings, expert scheduling, and standard appellate process. Digital evidence proved decisive in 3 cases: Harris, Finn, and Harrah, each showing how communications never meant for investigators' eyes became central to a prosecution. 2 cases, Walsh Berry and Bella Bond, required a clear distinction between the parent charged and the person who caused the death, and we maintained that distinction throughout rather than letting it blur. And the Harris case is a standing reminder that a verdict is not always final. Appellate courts remain part of the process long after a jury has spoken. If you found this file valuable, like this video, tell us in the comments which case you'd like us to revisit in depth, and subscribe to the Predator's Archive so you don't miss the next file. This has been the Predator's Archive. Thank you for watching.